Hi, everyone. Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council members in the Burien community. My name is Paige Morris, and I'm the city's environmental education specialist. And tonight I'm here to give an update on the city's climate action plan. Next slide, please. So tonight we're going to just go over the timeline of the climate action plan to date. We'll give a brief overview of the greenhouse gas inventory and the city's greenhouse gas reduction targets. Then we'll provide a quick summary of the first community workshop that we hosted in April. We'll give an overview of the goals and the strategies being considered for the climate action plan and follow up with next steps. Next slide, please. So in 2020, we finalized our greenhouse gas inventory for 2019 emissions. And since then, we've been developing our community engagement strategy and assembling a community advisory group and working with that group to identify the goals and the focus areas of the climate action plan. Right now, we're in the middle of developing our strategies and actions to meet the greenhouse gas reduction targets. We anticipate in the fall of this year, we'll have a draft Burien climate action plan that incorporates community feedback, and then have the plan adopted in late 2021 or early 2022. Next slide, please. Okay, so bear with me here while I explain our inventory. As a brief introduction, climate action plans are often strategic plans that many local governments use to lower greenhouse gas emissions through climate mitigation strategies. And while greenhouse gas emissions reductions are typically the primary goal of the plan, there are other goals of the climate plan that can be addressed as well, such as community resilience. So as you can see in this graph here, we have a large chunk of our emissions coming from transportation and mobile sources, and that is estimated through vehicle miles traveled through the City of Burien. And that information was provided to us by the Puget Sound Regional Council. This entire inventory was conducted using accepted tools and protocols. We use the US Community Protocol to complete the inventory, and all emissions were calculated through a modeling software called ClearPath, which takes into account not only just the vehicle miles traveled and the data provided to us from Puget Sound Regional Council, but as well as electricity consumption in our community and solid waste disposal in our community. Some of the highlights you can see from this graph show that a lot of our sources of greenhouse gas emissions come from not only just passenger vehicles in our community, but as well as residential natural gas usage. And that was collected from the two energy utilities that operate in our community. Next slide, please. So based on the greenhouse gas inventory, we set emission reduction targets. And in the short term, that looks like reducing our emissions 25% by 2025. Our medium-term goal is 50% reduction by 2030. And with our long-term goal being 95% reduction or greenhouse gas neutrality by 2050. And while we've set a goal of 50% reduction by 2030, we recognize that the science is telling us that we need to be ambitious and aggressive to incorporate the fair share of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've produced as a nation and community as a whole. And so our reduction strategies will actually focus on targets, or our actions will be focused to actually reduce closer to 60% by 2030. And the same can be said for the long-term goal of 95% reduction by 2050. We wanted to stay aligned with the new Washington State greenhouse gas reduction targets, which were adopted in June of 2020. And we acknowledge the need for urgent and immediate action to reduce the most severe impacts of climate change. Next slide, please. This is another scary looking graph, but I will try my best to explain it. This is a wedge analysis that's used to help determine where we can start looking at strategies and actions to reduce our emissions in our community. And this is based off of the 2019 greenhouse gas inventory that you saw on a previous slide. So if we look at the graph, you can see a black line that says business as usual at the top. And this is if we don't do anything as a community. It's in the absence of federal or state actions as well. And the changes in the graph, or the business as usual line, is attributed to population change and job growth. When you take a look at the gray portion of the graph here, it incorporates reductions in emissions based on federal fuel standards, which are progressively getting better, and the CETA, which is the Clean Energy Transformation Act that Washington State passed in 2019, which looks at helping get our energy utilities to start reducing greenhouse gas emissions over time. All of the colored portions of the graph following below really look at local actions that we can take as a community to help reduce our greenhouse gas emissions over time. Just to point out a few, when you look at the larger light yellow portion, it talks about natural gas usage in residential homes and switching that to electricity. And if you take a look at the light green portion of the graph, it talks about energy efficiency upgrades in our homes. Next slide, please. So knowing what we knew about the greenhouse gas emissions and how we can potentially reduce our emissions over time, we set out to have our first community advisory group workshop to focus on the goals and the vision of the climate action plan with our community advisory group. So we gathered feedback in an online webinar over Zoom like this. And we also used a software that we'll show later called Mural to gather feedback like in virtual sticky notes. We had 15 community advisory group members attend the first workshop and 24 additional community members. Next slide. Here's just a few of the things we heard when we were in the workshop. The community and the community advisory group, as well as other participants, noted that they want more green jobs in our community. They want to expand green spaces, engage the young people in climate action, as well as offer new public transportation options and improve the walking and biking infrastructure in the city. They also expressed the need for an accessible and transparent process in developing the climate action plan, and many attendees noted the need to work outside of the city limits of Burien, like with our neighboring jurisdictions. Next slide. So this is an example of what the mural boards looked like online. They were both in English and in Spanish for people who were attending. We asked some questions such as, what does Burien look like in 2030 to you? What does it look like in 2050? What does sustainability mean to you? Next slide. And here's just a screenshot example of some of the comments we received on one of the boards, talking about what do you want this plan to achieve? They want well-being for all, a healthy community, and sustainable land use. What does sustainability mean to you? It means preserving tree canopy cover and leaving something healthy behind. Next slide. From the workshop, we were able to pull together a community-led vision for the climate action plan, stating that in the future, we want to see a climate smart and climate resilient Burien that preserves its cultural diversity, its close-knit community, its green spaces while increasing affordable housing options, expanding accessible public transportation, and expanding social services and publicly funded subsidy programs that make Burien a more equitable place to live. Next slide. So we developed within this first workshop some goals that align with each focus area in the climate action plan, and there are 5 focus areas that are supported by goals, strategies, and actions. The goals help outline the framework that guides the climate action plan in addition to the vision statement you just heard, and they're typically broader and more generalized statements because they're followed by more specific strategies and actions. So the strategy itself will include a set of actions that is centered on a common focus. And then the actions are like the building blocks to take for climate action itself. Next slide. So the first focus area of the climate action plan is transportation and land use. You can see here we have 2 overarching goals followed by several strategies. Some of the actions being considered in this focus area is increasing bikeways in Burien, as well as updating land use and zoning codes to prioritize the development of a 10-minute community. Next slide. Excuse me. The second focus area is the buildings and energy sector. Again, we have 2 high-level goals as followed by several strategies. Some of the actions we're considering in this section of the plan is implementing building code changes to promote energy efficient buildings and requiring electric vehicle ready infrastructure for new development. Next slide. The third focus area is around materials and consumption. We have one overarching goal and several strategies to follow. And we heard from several community members, they want to start engaging the youth through recycling education programs and through school gardens. And we want to consider some actions around strengthening the purchasing policy at the city and supporting repair and reuse workshops within our community. Next slide. The fourth area of the plan is water and natural systems, so looking at some of the areas of our community that we need to preserve, and two overarching goals and two strategies follow. Some of the actions we are looking at are incentivizing more green stormwater infrastructure in our community, as well as strengthening codes to protect our natural environment. Next slide. And our final focus area is talking about community resilience and well-being. We know there's a huge overlap between climate action planning and other initiatives the city is already working on, and we want to help support that through this, through this plan. So some of the actions we're looking at doing in this goal area is creating more green space in Burien, as well as conducting targeted outreach to communities that are disproportionately affected by climate change. Next slide. The next steps that we're taking for the climate action plan is finalizing our city staff engagement, which we've been doing the month of May. We'll be hosting another workshop in the end of June, so early summertime. And then we'll be providing the first community survey to have the other residents in Burien respond about these strategies and actions. Next slide. So I'm here to answer any questions people might have about the plan.
Go ahead, Councilmember Toston.
Thank you, Mayor. Paige, thank you very much for all the work that you've done on this. As you know, this is near and dear to my heart, something I've spent years and years thinking about and working on. So one request I have is that we try really, really hard to adopt this before the end of this year. I will not be on council after this time, so just personal requests there. But I also have some questions about some of the strategies and actions, because I assume the actions are going to get down to much more details, obviously. And I don't know if that's coming from advisory groups or what other communities have done, what's being done elsewhere in the world, because there's a tremendous amount of work, obviously, going on by a lot of entities on climate and the way that we would implement some of these strategies. I mean, there's tried and true ways, there's innovative ways, there's creative ways. And so I'm just curious about sort of that process for getting to the actions. And then I have a couple of other questions as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I didn't want to overwhelm everyone with the list of actions that we've been developing, but exactly like you pointed out, Councilmember Tosta, we have been using the resources that have been available from other cities in our region who've already created climate action plans. The King County Toolkit was a huge resource for our community to help start that process, because they recommended really feasible actions that a community of our size can take and implement. Working with the K4C on helping develop some of these actions as well. So we've been really looking locally to make sure we're staying in alignment with other Puget Sound cities, but taking inspiration from other plans that have been made around the country. There's several that have done a really good job of incorporating the last goal area, the community resilience, well-being, and the equity portion, and making sure that we listen to what the community is saying. And that was a big piece that we heard in the first workshop of, we need to be thinking a little more holistically when we climate action plan, because we need to get more people on board with the climate action planning. So the actions need to be feasible and attainable from both the government level as well as the community level.
Great. Well, thank you. If I may, so the knowing that the emission estimates came from PSRC and some of the transportation modeling work that they do, it strikes me that one of the issues that we have with 48% of our greenhouse gases being transportation, 509 has to contribute a significant amount to that. And it, given connecting 509 to 5 sometime in early 2030s, that's going to change. The number of vehicles that are going through Burien would be my guess. And so these aren't necessarily sort of our population. I mean, this is passed through a fair amount of it. Is it possible for PSRC to work with you and us to separate what those emissions coming from 509 versus sort of the rest of the transportation infrastructure we manage, and track those separately, so that if we indeed are making progress in our own community based on bike lanes and pedestrians and improvements, more electric vehicles, we can demonstrate that we're doing that, even if 509 continues to sort of go off the charts because of the increase in traffic that we anticipate happening there. Is it possible to get sort of a slightly finer resolution as we look at those transportation emissions?
I saw Maya kind of like nodding her head, yes.
That would make sense. And it seems like that data would be easy to get because we have the volumes and we'll be able to continue to get the volumes, and we should be able to get the breakdown of trucks versus other vehicles. So it seems reasonable that we should be able to, here's where you come in, Paige, put that into our model as those traffic volumes change over the next several years.
Yeah, and I will add that the way the model works now in ClearPath and generally how vehicle miles traveled is assumed is it's not taking every car that comes through. It's like a 50% of like how many trips are made within Burien jurisdiction, and then 50% of the trips made from Burien out, and 50% of them made from out in to Burien. So I think there is some assumptions already built into the model of thinking like it can't all be from one jurisdiction, but that's a great point, and we can probably start working with PSRC on that.
Great. And then two other things on the resilience. So for a lot of years when I was a consultant, I did work not only in mitigation, but in adaptation. Resilience seems to be the new terminology that folks want to use. But I think, some of the potential known impacts of rising temperatures, increased storm intensity, sea level rise, all of those will potentially impact the population in our community in different neighborhoods and in different ways. So I would hope that, looking at taking into account some of those known impacts, helps us prepare. I mean, if we have a massive heat wave and we need cooling centers, I mean, how do we manage that? If we've got, just massive stormwater runoff, and Maya, I know this is, our lovely aging infrastructure, which was not necessarily designed to handle this. But how do we just take those things into account? I mean, sort of recognize that they're going to happen. And the more we think about it ahead of time, the better prepared we can be, obviously. So, and then one last comment is just, there are things obviously the city can do. And I really hope that, with your work, and I know Maya's commitment to this and others, that we demonstrate what it takes to provide this kind of leadership. We do look at, and we've talked about this before, electrifying our vehicle fleet, setting up the charging infrastructure, thinking about, moving away from any use of natural gas, all of those things that we're hoping the community will also recognize that as a city, we do that and we talk about it. And we talk about it in a way so that, folks recognize that it's possible and it's necessary and we're capable and we're leading.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it wasn't explicitly called out in each little section, but there is a focus for some actions to be on government operations and some to be focused on community. And we'll make sure to make that clear in the plan.
And one last thing, having planted the Arbor Day tree for many years that I've been in office, we need to plant 100 trees rather than one tree on Arbor Day. I mean, just those kinds of things. So anyway, thank you again for your efforts on this and for bringing the community along. I know there's a strong cadre of folks in the community who care a great deal about this, and we're lucky to have them, and we're lucky to have you providing the leadership. So thanks.
Thank you. Go ahead, City Manager Wilson.
Thank you. Paige, I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the airport and the aircraft and the, I know through our airport committee, there has been concern about how we account for aircraft, whether we should or whether that should be separated. And maybe the thoughts that you have to date regarding that issue.
Yeah, thank you, City Manager Wilson. We heard from the community during the workshop about the airport as well. What I wanted to highlight in the greenhouse gas inventory was that we can only control what's within our jurisdiction. And I know that that's been a common theme with work being so close to the port. We do get support from the port for a few things that we can take advantage of. The plan will be addressing ways in which we can continue to work with the Port of Seattle on helping to mitigate some of those effects or adapt, like Councilmember Tosta discussed, adapt to those effects and make our communities healthy and safe. Unfortunately, we just don't have the authority over the greenhouse gas emissions that the port produces, though that should not stop us from continuing the work that we are already doing with the Port of Seattle and continuing to reduce those emissions as much as we can. And the port has their own plan that they're working on to reduce their emissions. So we will be, talking about this within our plan, but there's other aspects that we want to address as well throughout the plan and the other focus areas. Does that answer your question, City Manager Wilson?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to reiterate that from the airport committee perspective, they really like to have, how are we going to integrate what's happening with the port and aircraft into our plan in some form or another. And so recognizing the authority issue, which, is a very, it's handled by the feds and dealt in that regard. I know our committee is looking for ways to how can we advocate for change regarding sustainable fuels and steps to reduce aircraft emissions.
All right, council, is there any other council member that'd like to speak? All right, thank you so much, Paige, for your presentation today. Oh, hold on, Councilmember Schilling.
It's so funny when everyone was pointing a different direction to try to get you to know where I was, Mayor, but we're all in different places. I just want to say that I'm a big fan of what's been presented here. I think that there's a lot of significant opportunity for city-based nudges for the community, like please compost, please think about driving less and riding a bike. I love that you said we're sort of going to try to become a 10-minute city. I know that large metropolitan areas are trying to become 15-minute cities. Well, we'll show them, but I think that's a great goal. I think the idea of working with new buildings to become more energy efficient is also a really great opportunity for us. And we're looking into 2050. So this is some long-term planning, and I really appreciate it, especially when it comes to ways to protect stormwater infrastructure and native habitats, our coastline, and ensure that we have fewer flooding issues for the rest of our community. So great work. I'm excited for the final product.
Righty. Any other council member? Hearing nobody else, thank you very much, Paige. Appreciate it.
Thank you.